Well, let's talk about Saudi Arabia. Now, there's a lot to dive into, so this is going to be a multi-video series. In this video, we are going to be talking about the actual problem, the Saudi problem, and where it originates from and how bad it's become. But we are going to be also talking about how our political leaders are fully aware of this Saudi problem. They are fully aware of Wahhabism, the ideology that Saudi Arabia has been exporting around the world for decades. And we're also going to be talking about the reasons why we're not addressing our Saudi problem, mainly because people are making a lot of money off of Saudi Arabia, be it for oil or weapons. Also, we've got the petrodollar problem, and we have an ignorance problem coming from both the right and the left. A lot on the right just tend to lump all of Islam together and demonize every single Muslim as if they're all Wahhabists, which is absolutely not true. And on the left, they don't even want to talk about it at all because they call it Islamophobia. So we've got some problems. And one of the biggest problems that we're dealing with is the fact that Saudi Arabia has been able to export an ideology around the world. But in order for us to fully understand the problem and the reason why I classify Saudi Arabia as a terrorist organization, in fact, I believe that they are a very long-running and highly effective terrorist organization. And we need to understand their roots, where they came from, why they've been able to remain in power for 275 years. So let's talk about the problem. In 1744, there was a man named Muhammad ibn Saud. He's the patriarch, the ultimate patriarch of the Saudi family, which, by the way, the Saudi family at this point, they estimate there's about 30,000 members overall that stem from this Muhammad ibn Saud. And there was also a religious zealot named Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. Now, Saud was the chief of a small agricultural settlement in the center of the Arabian Peninsula, and Wahhab was he was a religious ideologue. He was a zealot. He had the vision to reform Islam. Wahhab felt like Muslims at the time were not practicing Islam in the correct way. He felt like they were apostate or infidels, that they had gone astray. They were way too liberal for his tastes. He was an ultra-conservative, far-right religious zealot, and he believed things that his fellow Muslims at the time just simply did not believe. The Ottomans were a fairly liberal Islamic culture, and many in the rest of the Arabian Peninsula were also very liberal at the time. And there was a deep-rooted sentiment against the Ottomans, so you kind of have to understand why this Wahhabism was able to take hold. It's because the people in the Arabian Peninsula at the time they had a lot of animosity against the Ottomans. So since the Ottomans were very liberal, there was sort of this attitude of, well, they're liberal, we hate them, we want to be different from them, so we'll be ultra-conservative. Now, this wasn't by any means the majority way of thinking. The vast majority of people, even in the Arabian Peninsula, did not agree with this. They were much more liberal, and they felt like Wahhab's ideas were not for real life. But he did. For example, some of the things that Wahhab believed that his fellow Muslims at the time did not was, at the time, if a woman committed adultery, she was put in jail for a couple of months. Wahhab believed she should be stoned to death. If you had sex outside of marriage, that wasn't considered a crime. But to Wahhab, it merited public flogging. Muslim women were educated, homosexuality wasn't punished by death, and neither of those things were acceptable to Wahhab. He was extreme, and he believed that if Muslims didn't practice Islam in the way he envisioned it, then they should be killed violently. To him, that was justified. It was jihad. It was holy war in the name of God. Now, Saud, the man who ran the agricultural settlement, he understood Wahhab's desire to spread his brand of Islam far and wide. And Saud had his own ambitions that Wahhab understood, which was to create a massive kingdom in the Arabian Peninsula, to unite the Arabian Peninsula. At the time, the peninsula was under various factions of rule all around. Saud envisioned bringing them all together under one kingdom, and Wahhab envisioned that one kingdom practicing his form of extreme Islam. So they made a deal. The two saw each other's ambitions, and they made a deal with one another, a pact. And they even married off their children in order to solidify that pact. The deal went like this. Saud would raise a militia, but not just any militia, a holy militia, an army guided by Wahhab's ideology. And they would go and raid nearby settlements. They would force the people to convert or be killed. And once they converted, Wahhab would teach his brand of Islam. And part of those teachings would include taxation and obedience to their new king, Saud. So this was an extremely lucrative alliance for the two. Wahhab would get his message spread far and wide. And if it meant acts of jihad against the people, then that's what it meant. And Saud would end up getting to claim more and more territory. So this alliance was extremely effective. In fact, within the course of about 70 years, this one family had essentially gone from basically having a farm to running the entire Arabian Peninsula. They formed a militia, and then they went around taking over swaths of land and massacring people who didn't adhere to God's will. God's will being Wahhab's extreme vision of Islam that at the time, the majority of people did not practice. So if you really think about what they were doing, this actually sounds a lot like Al-Qaeda, right? This just happened to be way more successful. So what they were doing was they said, okay, we're going to go around violently force people to live under our religious rule. And that is what we classify today's terrorists as. That's what ISIS is doing. That's what Al-Qaeda is doing. Now, those groups stemmed from this ideology, and we'll get into that. But you know, if you could imagine if bin Laden were actually successful and he was able to actually gain more swaths of land and force everybody to live under his ideology, how is that any different than what the Saud family was able to accomplish with Wahhab at their side, the Saud-Wahhab pact? It sounds a lot similar. So the thing is that, yes, this is in the past. This was 1744 through the 1700s into the 1800s. But here's the thing. This isn't just Saudi Arabia's past. It's their present as well. Once the Saud family gained control of the peninsula, they continued to maintain their power by ensuring the entire population was well indoctrinated. They need everybody to believe this indoctrination in order to maintain control over that population. So throughout history and even today, they have ensured that every Saudi is taught Wahhabism in school, in their mosques, on television, everywhere. Saudi Arabia today, like I said, is it's a manifestation of this idea that is spread, and it's a direct result of this pact. It is not something where this religion just happened to be a phenomenon and took hold of the people and it spread and people started believing it. It's way bigger than that. They were forced into this ideology, and then their children were indoctrinated, and their grandchildren were indoctrinated, and their great-grandchildren were indoctrinated. And now you've got a population of people who've been indoctrinated into this Wahhabism. Now, a couple of points I want to make about that. Because even though Saudi Arabia does, Wahhabism is their actual state-sponsored religion, it doesn't mean that everybody in Saudi Arabia is a Wahhabist. The estimation at this point is that 40% of the population believes in it, and the other 60% doesn't believe in it. Whether the 60% practice a different form of Islam completely, maybe they be Shia Muslims, or maybe they just don't practice Wahhabist, Salafist style Islam, or they be, it's really difficult to be really any other religion in Saudi Arabia because they're persecuted, and I don't even know if it's legal. Another thing to note before we go any further in this is that Wahhabism is not a term any of the Wahhabists would ever use. They just call themselves Muslims. This is what makes it particularly difficult to identify. This is part of the big problem. They don't say, oh, I'm a Wahhabist. They just say that they are Muslims. And it takes a measure of questioning and knowledge in order to identify who is a Wahhabist. So that is something to take into consideration before moving forward. Another thing to note is that Wahhabism in this form of Islam is in the minority for the majority of Muslims in the world. The rest of the majority of the world's Muslims do not practice this very extreme form of Wahhabism. Now, Wahhabists, by the way, I should also mention, they would call themselves Salafists, but for purposes of this video and to make things very clear, we're just going to call them Wahhabists. They won't identify as that. That's not what they call themselves. And there have been branches that have broken off from Wahhabism, like ISIS and what they practice, which is pretty much the same thing, though. So now let's talk about how the Saudis have been able to build an extensive Wahhabist network in the United States and how bad the problem actually is for us. Saudi's ambitions didn't stop with the Arabian Peninsula. Ever since they discovered oil in the 1930s, which made them very, very wealthy, the Saudis have been able to exponentially increase their influence around the world by including into the United States, because when you've got money, you can do absolutely anything. So in the last 2 decades alone, now we know this has been going on longer than the last 2 decades, but in the last 2 decades alone, we know that Saudi Arabia has spent nearly $100 billion funding their Wahhabist movement around the world. This includes funding mosques, building schools, training imams, publishing books and materials, and even funding American Muslim student organizations and lobby groups. So the publishing of books and materials, by the way, speaking of ISIS actually used the Saudi texts and the Saudi publications to indoctrinate their own and to teach their children in their caliphates. So that's how extreme the ideology is coming out of Saudi Arabia. ISIS used it up until 2015 before they could write their own texts, but that's what they were using. So that just gives you an idea. Now let's talk about the mosques in America. In 1999, Sheikh Hisham Kabani of the Islamic Supreme Council of America estimated that a whopping 80% of the mosques in America were infiltrated in one way or another with Wahhabi doctrine. So they were funding mosques. The Saudi Arabian government was going around funding and building some of the biggest mosques in the United States, some of the most beautiful big mosques in the U.S. that make the list for, oh, look at this beautiful mosque, Wahhabi funded. The other ways that they've been able to infiltrate is through, a lot of it is through funding, but a lot of it is also through sending textbooks. The Saudi Arabian government, because they are so wealthy, they were able to translate a lot of the text from Arabic into English. And then, of course, since a lot of the American Muslims do not speak Arabic, they were then sent English materials, but those English materials were actually translated by Wahhabist Muslims. So they've been able to infiltrate about 80% of the mosques in America. Now, I want to stress something, that this does not mean that 80% of American Muslims support Wahhabism or even follow it. It would be very similar to, say, like kids that go to Catholic school, they don't all come out believing in Catholicism. They were maybe taught it, they were indoctrinated with it, but it doesn't mean they walk out of there being these devout Catholics. We know that that's not true. It is very similar when it comes to these mosques and these schools. I want to stress that point. But the point I do want to make is that their influence has spread all throughout, that these mosques are being funded by them, which means that they're then being encouraged to use their materials, and their materials are quite extreme. They're not just extreme in that they're ultra conservative far right, but they're extreme in that they believe that if you do not follow that particular brand of Islam, if you are Muslim, but you're not that kind of Muslim, or if you're not a Muslim at all, if you're a Christian or a Jew or something else, then you are an enemy. And many of them believe that, and many of the texts read that those enemies should be met with violent deaths. So this is in their texts, and we've allowed these texts to come into our country and infiltrate our mosques. Now, beyond the mosques, when we talk about the schools, they've been able to infiltrate American universities. The Muslim Students Association of America is an organization that was funded and established by the Saudis. So the New York Times reported in 2008 that the Muslim Students Association of America received its funding and direction from Saudi Arabia. And that actually the Muslim Student Association was the first effort in America by the Saudis to establish Islamic organizations around the world to promote Wahhabism, Wahhabi Islam. So, which is the strain of Islam that eventually gives birth to Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Taliban. Now, they organized and funded the Muslim Student Association back in the 60s. So we do know that they've been infiltrating our population since at least the 60s. Now let's talk about, which is a big problem when you think about it, when you've got this Muslim Student Association that is being funded by Saudi Arabia, being sent texts and literature from Saudi Arabia, and if Saudi Arabia's only exported version of Islam is Wahhabism, we've got a problem on our hands. Now, of course, I want to stress again that not every member of the Muslim Student Association or even leader or chapters around the country are fully in adherence or believe in Wahhabism, but the fact is that the messages are still seeping in. In prison, let's talk about the U.S. prison system. Islam is the fastest growing religion in prisons. 80% of all prison converts to any religion are to Islam, 80%. Now, in 2003, officials looked into the New York and to the federal prison system and found that every single imam that was hired to preach and teach Islam in the New York State prison system and in the federal prison system, every single imam was a Wahhabist. They were sponsored by Saudi Arabia in one way or another, and they found that they were preventing any non-Wahhabist Muslim from even receiving their form of, their branch of the religion. So could you imagine, as a Christian, if you're in prison and the only Christian pastor they give you is, let's say, a Catholic priest, and you're sitting there and you're like, yeah, but I'm a Lutheran, or I'm an Episcopalian, or I'm a Mormon, or I'm a Jehovah's Witness. And they say, too bad, you're only getting this Catholic priest. That's what was going on in these prisons. Now, they only looked into New York and federal prisons, so we don't know about the rest of the prisons around the country, but I can tell you they likely were because the U.S. government or any entity that when they need a recommendation for who they can hire, if you've got like a majority Christians or majority Jew or majority Mormon or whatever it is, right, that are running an organization, they realize they need to hire an imam. Well, they need a recommendation. When they need a recommendation, they often turn to the Islamic Society of North America, which is the largest Muslim organization in North America. And in fact, this organization is the one that would recommend all of the imams for the prison system. Well, the problem with ISNA is that they're funded by Saudi Arabia. They have direct ties to Saudi Arabia, and they've been promoting Wahhabi political, ideological, and theological ideas, which we'll get into that a little bit more. But we found that in 2003, when there was an investigation done just into the New York and federal system of prisons, they discovered that the prisons had been hiring these imams that were Wahhabists for the last 20 years, and that was in 2003. Let's talk about the American lobbies. We've got CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. They describe themselves as a nonprofit, grassroots membership organization established to promote a positive image of Islam and Muslims in America. What CARE doesn't tell you is that they receive direct funding from Saudi Arabia. In fact, when they built their headquarters in Washington, D.C., they received hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Saudi government in order to build it. The Muslim American Society is also a large lobby organization here in the U.S. Now, something to point out. The United Arab Emirates has designated both of those lobby organizations as terrorist groups because of their affiliation to Saudi Wahhabism and the Muslim Brotherhood. So if the United Arab Emirates is going to say CARE and the Muslim American Society are terrorist organizations, maybe we should be looking into that. CARE, by the way, has claimed that 70% of American Muslims want Wahhabism taught in their mosques. CARE received hundreds of thousands of dollars from Saudi Arabia, and so has the Muslim American Society, and so has the Muslim Student Association. So we've got a real problem of this infiltration of this ideology. And again, it's because Saudi Arabia has so much money. They're the country in the Middle East with gobs and gobs of money. And now their oil company, Aramco, has gone public, and their IPO was the largest in history, hitting $1 trillion. That is alarming, beyond alarming. They now have more money than they know what to do with. They've always had a lot of money. And when you've got money, you've got a lot of power. And so we should be very worried about what they're going to do with that money when it comes to the spread of their ideology around the world. Speaking of ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, in a testimony before the U.S. Senate in October of 2003, Dr. Michael Waller told senators that the Islamic Society of North America refers Muslim clerics to the U.S. Bureau of Prisons. The Islamic Society of North America is an influential front for the promotion of the Wahhabi political, ideological, and theological infrastructure in the United States and Canada, claiming that ISNA has connections to 50 to 79% of mosques on the North American continent. He accused the organization of dominating Islam in North America. Similarly, Stephen Schwartz, who himself is a Muslim, described ISNA in Senate hearing testimony as maintaining open and close relationships with the Saudi government. And as just to show that this is not something that's in the past with their value structure, but in July of 2017, at an annual convention of ISNA, representatives from the groups Muslims for Progressive Values, so these are more liberal Muslims, and the Human Rights Campaign, which is an LGBT group, were asked to shut down their booths at the annual convention of ISNA because they were told that the convention was a religious, private, and family-oriented event. These people have no desire to bring in more progressive, liberal Islamic values. So you can see that through our schools, from the student organizations on the university campuses, in our prisons. The ISNA also is the organization that recommends imams to the military. So in the military, in the prison system, in our schools, our lobby groups, all of them are infiltrated with Saudi money and Wahhabism. So this problem is really, really large. And Wahhabism, once again, teaches absolute intolerance. You cannot be another form of Islam. You cannot be a Christian or a Jew or a non-believer. They believe that that is absolutely against God, and you should be met with a violent death. It teaches jihad. Now, of course, not every Wahhabist turns into a jihadist, but pretty much every jihadist is a Wahhabist. So we've got a serious issue that we have to deal with. Now, one thing to point out is that Wahhabism is particularly dangerous for other Muslims. They're the most at risk. They're the most oppressed group when it comes to Wahhabism. Because, first of all, because the right and the left has a tendency to lump all Muslims together, basically like, oh, it's Islam, don't criticize Islam, or on the right, they only criticize Islam and they're not specific. On the left, they're unwilling to criticize at all, and they're, again, not specific. So you've got a problem where all these Muslims are lumped together, which is, I mean, could you imagine? And on top of it, the Wahhabists inside of the Muslim community, they're extremely intimidating, and they believe that these non-believing Muslims should die violent deaths. So these Muslims are fearing, they can't speak out. They're met with violence if they speak out, or they're met with intimidation. And they're very similar in a way, I would say, to maybe a wife that's being beaten at home and she's afraid to say anything because she's afraid she's going to be killed. That's what's going on with all of these non-Wahhabist Muslims. They're afraid to say anything. And then so inside of their Muslim community, they're afraid to speak up. They're afraid to fight back. They're often met with death around the world if they do. And outside of the Muslim community, they're met with a lot of ignorance. So it's particularly dangerous for the other Muslims who are not practicing Wahhabism here in the United States and around the world. Now, again, not everyone who's taught Wahhabism ends up a believer. A lot of them end up rejecting it. They hear it and they say, yeah. They roll their eyes. Like I mentioned, a Catholic kid going to school, kind of rolls his eyes and say, okay, whatever. Doesn't really believe it. So it's important to understand that. It's also important to reiterate, they will not ever identify as Wahhabists. That's just not what they do. There's also branches that have kind of broken off from Wahhabism, but that's where they stem from. The root is Wahhabism, which is why I'm using that term in particular. But they have been able to export it around the world, and these other forms maybe go by different names or, based on the local language. And lastly, before I end this, and like I said, this is going to be a multi-part series where we go into the political leaders being fully aware and the things that our politicians know and why we're basically our deep ties, our financial ties to Saudi Arabia. We're going to go into all of that. But the last thing that I want to bring up before we close this chapter down is it is absolutely not Islamophobic to call this out. It's not Islamophobic to say there are extremists in our midst. And they're not only scary to us, they're scary to the non-Wahhabist extreme Muslims. And we all need to be working together, these non-extremist Muslims and non-Muslims together, to root out this extremism that has infiltrated our government, has infiltrated our schools, our prisons, our military, our everyday life. They have infiltrated. And even if we're not seeing a huge number of jihadist attacks here in America, because we're seeing a lot more over, obviously, in Asia and in Europe. Here in the United States, we've been largely isolated from it. But how long are we going to be isolated from it if Saudi Arabia continues to gain all of this money and all of this influence and continues to use their money and influence to export this ideology to continue their power around the world? They have gotten to this point in history, 275 years after making this pact. They've gotten this far with this ideology. What makes us think they would stop? Why wouldn't they continue? If it's worked this well, what would be their incentive to stop exporting this ideology around the world? What would prevent them from, which they have been exporting it all throughout the Middle East. We've seen them export it to destabilize regions around them in order for them to control those regions even further. They are the reason why the Taliban exists. It's because of Wahhabism. The reason Al-Qaeda, it's because of Wahhabism. ISIS, Wahhabism, all of it stems from Wahhabism. And they're not stopping in the Middle East. They're continuing to infiltrate, and other ways they've infiltrated us have been very crafty here in the United States. The lobbies, the narratives, the Islamophobia, whether it be people who are fairly Islamophobic because they think it's all Muslims, or people who say, oh my God, you're an Islamophobe, don't say anything. All of that contributes to Saudi Arabia's power and influence and continued spread of Wahhabism. We need to keep our eyes open to this, and we need to be able to open dialogue and be honest and truthful and forthcoming about what is going on here on our soil. Thank you so much for watching. Again, more to come with this in this series. I know I've said that before. So regarding the West Bank and the footage that I still am working on that footage, and I will be sharing more of what I saw on the West Bank. That stuff is coming. The plight of the Palestinians, how they are being very oppressed. I will be showing more about, so don't worry, that stuff is coming as well. I know a lot of people have been asking me about that. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe and hit the bell.